Today we're going to talk about how to lay out a report. Right now I'm going to stay very theoretical, I guess you could say, abstract. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of using InDesign. I will do that in a separate tutorial. Learning how to use InDesign is a whole task in and of itself. But today I want to make sure you understand what my expectations are in terms of your report layout, and honestly, some good rules to follow for any layout of any report or document that you're going to create. So, when you create a report, you're going to have to make quite a few design decisions. The report that you're going to create for this particular class is going to include facing pages. In other words, pages that are on the left side and right side, just like when you read a book. So the idea is that you print this out and would probably read this in print and not on a screen. Regardless, when you create something like this, you need to make all sorts of decisions in order to have a design that holds well together and that looks professional. The basic decisions I've listed on this page. So first is your header, footer, frame, whatever you use on every single page in order to give some kind of structure to your report. So in our case, this must include the page number and the report name. I will give you lots of examples in a minute, don't worry. The next is fonts, which I will go in detail on in the pages to come. Then whether you want a single column design or multi-column design, the justification of the text, in other words, if it's ragged on the right, ragged on the left, or full justify. Then how you're going to deal with titles, subtitles, captions, any kind of contrasting text in your report, and finally the colors. Now, most of you, I believe, already have color schemes chosen. Make sure that the contrast works well for that, and we can go over it together. Generally, you want to go with just a couple contrasting colors, if any, in your overall text, and then really stick to the contrasting colors in the illustrations. First, though, let's talk about fonts. So the basic division in fonts is between serif and sans serif. The word sans, by the way, means without in French. So fonts in general can be divided into two groups. There's actually more groups than that, but in print, generally it's two groups: serif font and sans serif font. A sans serif font basically does not have the little feet, and the serif fonts do have the little feet. So if you look at the illustration on the right here, you can see that there are two fonts up top that are sans serif. They don't have the little feet, and then the fonts below do have the little feet. Those can be just regular serifs or square serifs. Generally, a sans serif font is going to look more modern, and a serif font is going to look more classical. Typography is a very complex discipline, and there's a lot of stuff that you can learn about typography. For one, every single part of a letter has different names, and depending on how you do it, it can have very clear connotations. I don't want to go into the super deep end on this, at least not for this particular assignment. The fact is, the way that you want to approach your report is pretty straightforward. You're going to want to choose a font that's going to be your main text font, your body text font. If you want to go on the more modern side, that body text should be a sans serif font. If you want to go for a more classical side, that font should be a serif font. In general, stick with a font that is well known. So go ahead with Times New Roman or Palatino or Garamond if you want to go for a serif font. If you want to go for a sans serif font, Arial or Helvetica are kind of the standards. Do not choose a crazy pants font, okay? No Buffy font or, Halloween font or, God forbid, Wingdings or something, okay? Just stick with very straightforward fonts. Don't go crazy here, okay? In your contrasting font for your titles or subtitles or captions, generally you're going to want to use a font that contrasts with your main font. So if you have a serif font for your regular body text font, you may want a sans serif font for your contrasting font. You don't have to, but make sure to stick with 2 or 3 families of fonts only. Don't go crazy here, right? Stick with just 2 or 3 different ones. The one exception is for title, especially your page, your report title, the front page of your report. There you can go a little bit more, kind of further away from, classic stuff and be a little bit more creative. Don't mess with things like kerning. Kerning is the spacing between the characters. Don't mess with anything beyond the very basics here. This requires a great deal of understanding to mess with that stuff. You're not there, so don't touch that stuff. When you lay stuff out on the page, you're going to be tempted to put it in 12-point font because that's what you use when you write a paper. But if you do that in a report, it's going to look like a 10-year-old did it because it's going to look way too big. Generally, in print text, I would say 10 point, maybe 11 point would be good. You definitely don't want to go smaller than about 9 point, but 12 point is going to be too big. So be careful with that. In general, when you lay stuff out, print it out, see how it looks. And if it looks wrong, then change it. You can use italics and bold. Not all fonts offer italics and bold, so please be aware of that. But if you're going to use that, make sure to use it consistently so that you don't confuse the reader. As I mentioned, typography is very complex. You can download all sorts of fonts from the internet and experiment. But by and large, be relatively conservative with this. So what are good page layouts? What are they going to look like? Well, they're going to look something like this. So this is a book, you'll notice, that has a 2-column design for the text. It has the page numbers and a header at the top. And notice how everything aligns here, how the number and the name of the author and the line all line up at the top, and that in turn lines up with the columns. Also notice how the font of the text is a serif font, so a more classical font, and then the contrasting font, both the caption, the subheading, and the header are all sans serif font, and they're the same sans serif fonts. That's very important. Also notice how the text is full justify, which means it aligns on both the left and the right, with the exception of a tab to start the paragraph. So this looks quite nice and professional. Another thing I want you to notice about this page is how the illustration takes up both columns so that it's nice and big and legible, which is a very, very nice touch as well. Here's another example. In this case, it is a single column text. And notice that the page numbers are actually on the sides here, and that the page numbers as well as the subheading are sans serif, and again, the actual text is a serif font. So this again I think looks quite nice, quite professional. Again, this is full justify. Here's another example. In this case, it's also a single column, but the single column only uses up part of the page with the exception of the illustrations. This is a more complex layout, so you're probably only going to want to use a layout like this if you feel very confident about your design skills. In this case, the caption, instead of being in a contrasting font, is just in italics. So it's the same font, but in italics. So you can do that, right? But you just want to make sure that your font, again, works well and doesn't distract you too much from the text. Here's another example. In this case, the text is in one column, the caption takes up another column. This is the beginning of a chapter, and you'll notice that the chapter title is in a much more kind of creative font, right? But it's a very kind of classical looking font, almost like filigreed, which is nice. And again, notice that the illustration is taking up the whole page. Again, when you have an illustration, don't make your illustration too small. Make sure that the reader can read the illustration very well, okay? And another example. In this one, again, it's a single column design, full justify, and the chapter title is a sans serif font that contrasts with the overall font of the text. And I think this looks quite nice. A little bit plain maybe, but quite nice as well. Your report is actually going to be full color. A lot of these examples are not, just because they're books, and so printing a book in full color can be very pricey. And so in many cases, it's mostly going to be more coffee table books than the kind of textbooks that I have lying around that are interesting. But this is a book by possibly one of the most well-known designers of quantitative data. His name is Tufte. You can find his books anyway. This book is, again, very, very nice. This is a complex design here, right? Notice there's a main column for the text, and then there's a shorter, smaller column for the captions, and some illustrations align with the text, some illustrations align with the captions, and then the illustration on the right aligns on the whole page so that it's as big as possible. You can, again, do either or, but you want to try to work within your limitations. So if you're not the best designer ever, keep it simple, all right? Also notice in this case, this is not full justify text. This is left justify, so it's ragged on the right. And it still looks pretty neat, so that's okay too, right? It doesn't have to be full justify if you don't want it to be. I also want to call your eye to the bottom of the right side of the page, where he gives you advice about how to line up your illustrations, right? He says, don't put the illustration in the middle. Align the illustration with the columns of the text. It's going to make it look a lot nicer. Another thing that's really important is the use of white space. White space gives your eye space to breathe, to relax a little bit. So don't overfill your page. Don't write all the way into the margins. Don't have stuff like stuck right together. Make sure you give the reader space to breathe. White space is important. So the idea here is to be conservative, right? Don't put too much stuff in your layout. Keep things simple. So a couple different fonts, maybe with one font that pops. One or two colors, and then maybe an extra color that really pops that you use, let's say, for titles. A single column, or if you use two columns, that's great, but then have your illustrations take up the whole page so that it's as legible as possible. What I recommend that you do is take a look at your books or magazines, if you still have magazines lying around, reports you see, and see what layout appeals to you, what fonts appeal to you, and use those. Be inspired by those. You will find that you probably have a style. Maybe you like the serif fonts, more classical stuff. Maybe you like the more modern stuff. But start figuring out what you want your fonts to be, your general layout to be, so that when I give you the actual tutorials, you can focus more on the how to do it instead of what you're trying to do. Yep, that's it for today, and I will give you the tutorials next week. Thanks, you guys.